Welcome back to Take the Cannoli, the ultimate Mafia podcast. In this two-part episode, we're going to be looking at the House of Morello, the very first family in America's Cosa Nostra history that would go on to become the Luciano family before eventually becoming the Genovese family. When Giuseppe Morello disembarked from his transatlantic crossing in New York in 1892, he was not the first mafioso to enter the United States. Over the past 20 years, there had been many criminals who had fled southern Italy. Most were fleeing trials, jail sentences, and arrest, and all of them were low-level criminals, or at least low-ranking mafiosi. Any mafiosi facing charges or investigations at the time who were properly connected would take refuge on the mainland until political influence could be pulled to make criminal cases disappear. High-ranking mafiosi would not face the indignity of a transatlantic crossing and the lawless and wild frontier that was America at the time. Until Don Vito Cascioferro, from episode 4, made the trip in 1901, the Italian criminal fraternity in America lacked vision and real leadership. Giuseppe Morello was born in Corleone with a physical deformity. His right forearm was stunted, and his right hand only had one finger that was bent downwards, resembling a claw. For the wildly superstitious southern Italians, deformity was something to be feared, and for most rural Italians in the 1800s, such a deformity would consign them to a life of struggle and shame. Giuseppe's father died when he was only 5, and with now 2 young children to care for, his mother Angela remarried less than 1 year later. Her new husband, Bernardo Terranova, was a member of the Corleone Mafia and fully embraced the young Giuseppe as his own. Both Giuseppe and his sister Maria were as much a part of the family as the 5 children that Bernardo and Angela went on to produce. Morello and his 3 half-brothers, Vincenzo, Ciro and Nicholas Terranova, would go on to form the first family of Cosa Nostra in America. Through his stepfather's connections, Morello was inducted into the Corleone Mafia at an early age. The young Morello first made a name for himself by murdering Giovanni Vella, a police official who was currently investigating cattle thefts in western Sicily. Morello didn't handle the killing particularly well, managing to only mortally wound Vella even after shooting at close to point-blank range. This allowed Vella time to implicate several mafiosi on his deathbed. Corleone being Corleone, it was ensured that the subsequent investigation went nowhere, with vital pieces of evidence, including the murder weapon, disappearing and no solid witnesses to call on. Usually, a botched killing would quickly put an end to a young mafioso's career. However, Morello's value to the Corleone Mafia was not as an assassin. Corleone chiefs were impressed with his visions of moving the Corleone Mafia into more urban criminal enterprises. Morello went on to launch a vast counterfeiting ring that proved an incredible earner for the Corleone. Operating on a wide scale, it wasn't long before the state became aware of the vast number of forged notes that were being exchanged in western Sicily. With more vigour than they would normally investigate murder or corruption, the authorities soon uncovered Morello as the key suspect and ordered a trial in the city of Messina at the very eastern tip of the island, where they believed that the power of the Corleone Mafia couldn't reach. They were wrong. Morello was alerted to the upcoming charges and left for New York the next day. The state, desperate to send out a statement, were left with no prize for their show trial, and instead sentenced Morello in absentia to 6 years imprisonment, by which time he had been in America for over a year. Morello's wife, young son, and his extended family followed him to New York the following year. The America that the Morello Terranova clan arrived in was heavy with anti-Italian resentment. Italians at the time were supplanting the Irish as the dominant workforce of the eastern United States, working harder and often for less money than their Irish rivals. But what really sparked the anti-Italian feeling was the murder of Police Chief David Hennessey in New Orleans in 1890. Now, Hennessey was far from the moral, upstanding law enforcement hero that was portrayed in newspaper articles at the time of his assassination. In fact, Hennessey was a brutal man who had already stood trial for the murder of fellow police officer and New Orleans chief of detectives Thomas Devereaux. He went on to win an acquittal with a self-defense plea in that case. New Orleans was the American end of the lucrative citrus trade between Sicily and America. The earliest Sicilian immigrants to America settled in New Orleans, and the Sicilian population was growing rapidly. Control of the dockside unloading was contested by two rival families, the Provenzanos and the Mantrangas. After several Provenzanos were arrested and imprisoned for extortion and attempted murder by Hennessey, rumours began to circulate in the New Orleans Italian community that Hennessey was about to present new evidence that would clear the Provenzanos and implicate the Mantrangas instead. This, obviously, would put the Provenzanos back in control of the dockside. On October the 15th, 1890, Hennessey was shot by several gunmen on his walk home from police headquarters. Rushed to hospital, when asked by New Orleans police captain William O'Connor who had shot him, Hennessey simply replied, "Dagos." Hennessey died the next day. In response, the city of New Orleans rounded up over 250 Italians within 24 hours. The mayor of New Orleans, Joe Shakespeare, gave a speech where he announced that Hennessey was the victim of Sicilian vengeance. A committee was set up to investigate Italian secret organizations in New Orleans, and the Italian community were encouraged to inform on each other. Many public officials were only too happy to give insightful interviews with veiled threats against Italians, whether they were innocent or not. The press went on to build the public into a frenzy and lit the fuse for what was to follow. The trial of 9 of the suspects ended in chaos, when all were either acquitted or found not guilty because no evidence had ever been presented. The one man who had been the source of linking the murder to Italians, Captain O'Connor, was never called to testify. At the announcement of the verdict, members of the jury faced harassment, threats, and several were fired from their jobs for failing to convict the Italians. A group calling themselves the Committee on Safety took out advertisements in newspapers calling for citizens to assemble near the prison that the now free Italians were being still held in. Thousands turned up, and before long, the mob descended on the prison and began breaking down the door with a battering ram. The prison warden let the 19 Italian prisoners out of their cells and told them to hide as best they could. What seemed like an outburst of mob violence was actually a calculated lynching led by several prominent members of the New Orleans community that included a future New Orleans mayor, Walter Flower, and future Louisiana governor, John Parker. In total, 11 Italian prisoners were murdered, making it the largest mass lynching in US history. No criminal charges were ever brought, and the press of the time doubled down on their stance, further stoking anti-Italian flames. As several of the victims were Italian citizens, the Italian government, angered by the lack of justice, broke off diplomatic relations with the US. Benjamin Harris, the US president, desperate to avoid an international incident, declared Columbus Day a celebration of Italian history, and he agreed to pay $2,211.90 to each of the victims' families. Over the next 10 years, at least 8 more Italians were lynched in the city of New Orleans, none of which ever resulted in a prosecution. With work in short supply in New York City, the Morello Terranova clan soon departed for Louisiana, where they found work in the sugar fields. They then moved on to Texas, where they farmed cotton. Morello's vision of carving out a successful farming career came to an abrupt end when almost the entire family contracted malaria. Faced with the stark realization that sharecropping would never earn them anything above a pittance, the family decided to head back to New York, 4 years after first arriving. While working the land may not have made them fabulously wealthy, the Morello family returned to New York with a substantial sum to invest in businesses. The first business was an ornamental plastering business that was going to be run by Morello's stepfather. Giuseppe Morello himself attempted to launch several businesses, a couple of saloons, a coal business, and a date factory, all of them unsuccessful. Morello's attempts at carving out a legitimate life failed spectacularly, one after the other, eating up all of the money he had saved working the land. With a string of failures behind him, Morello reverted to the one thing he had always been successful at: counterfeiting. Morello set up a printing shop in East Harlem that would also double as a gang apartment. Morello's printing began with $5 bills that he sold to so-called queer pushers for $2 each. He began building up a network of fellow Sicilian and Irish associates to spread his empire further afield. However, the entire operation nearly ended before it even began, due to the curiosity of the maid that Morello had hired to clean and cook in the apartment. Molly Callahan was hired as a domestic servant, but instructed to stay out of the room that contained the printing press. Curiosity got the better of her, and Molly one night sneaked a look inside, only to be caught in the act by Morello. That was the last day that Molly Callahan was seen alive. Knowing that someone would eventually come looking for the girl, Morello switched operations to another secret location. When the police eventually did come inquiring about the maid, they found nothing incriminating in the apartment and chalked it up to just another runaway. For a small-scale counterfeiting ring, Morello's fledgling empire was operating well until two of the Irish queer pushers were arrested trying to pass forged notes in an oyster restaurant. That sparked a Secret Service investigation that would lead directly to Morello. One by one, the Irish associates gave up everything that they knew. Fortunately for Morello, he had cunningly built enough buffers between him and his Irish associates that most of them didn't know anything about him. When one of the Irishmen who did know Morello was describing him to agents outside a saloon bar, Morello happened to be walking by. Secret Service agents arrested him on the spot. However, Morello had no counterfeit currency on him, and aside from the testimony of an already convicted criminal, there was nothing to tie Morello to any crime. In fact, at the subsequent trial, Morello was released and completely exonerated. This incident further sharpened Morello's belief that Sicilians were the only reliable business partners. Over the course of the next 5 years, Morello grew his network, and with the assistance and guidance of Don Vito Cascioferro, plus the introduction of Cascioferro's protection pizzo technique, Morello turned a street gang into a regimented, highly disciplined, and incredibly lucrative criminal empire. One of Morello's closest allies was Ignazio the Wolf Lupo, a terrifying enforcer who is believed to have personally carried out over 60 murders. When he married Morello's stepsister, Salvatrice Terranova, it only served to forge the bond tighter. Morello and Lupo enjoyed complete dominance of Manhattan. Morello and Lupo demanded complete obedience from everyone who came into contact with them. In one case, a Sicilian grocer, Giuseppe Catania, had been overheard loosely talking in a bar about Morello and Lupo's counterfeiting operation. Catania's body was discovered on the shore of Bay Ridge in Brooklyn, his mutilated corpse stuffed inside a potato sack. The next incident that threatened Morello and Lupo's empire was the arrest of several of Morello's queer pushers, and ended in the barrel murder of 1902 that we covered in episode 4. The barrel murder of Madonna Benedetto led to the departure of Cascioferro back to Sicily and the attention of NYPD officer Joe Petrosino. By 1905, Morello was running the largest crime family in the United States and was considered the de facto capo di tutti capi in America. But two captains in his ranks, Giuseppe Masseria and Salvatore de Aquila, were waiting for any opportunity to feed their growing ambition. Just 5 years later, Morello's world would come crashing down with a 25-year prison sentence for running a counterfeiting ring from the Catskills. Lupo would be sentenced to 30 years. With Morello and the widely feared Lupo removed, Nicky Terranova took over the family with the help of his brothers. At the same time, one of the highly respected Morello captains, Gaetano Reina, split and formed his own family, a family that would eventually become the Lucchese family. Sensing weakness, several Camorra gangs from Brooklyn, particularly the Navy Street and Coney Island gangs, saw an opportunity in the waning power of the Morello family, and despite the efforts of Nicky Terranova to unite the two factions, the Camorristi decided to move into Morello territory and eliminate their Sicilian rivals. In part 2 of this episode, we're going to take a look at the Mafia Camorra War and the emergence of Joe the Boss Masseria and set the stage for the coming Castellamarese War. Until the next time, ciao tutti.